The last of the morning's weak light struggled through the grimy panes of the factory window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stale air. Cole didn't look up from the rusty lever he was trying to pry free. The smell of old oil, damp concrete, and something vaguely metallic had been his constant companion for the better part of a decade. He'd spent his adult life in places like this, salvaging what he could from the wreckage of forgotten industries. Colleague buildings were his domain, his comfort zone. They were predictable, their decay logical. This place, a skeletal textile mill, was his final job before the abrupt, bewildering shift in his life. The letter, thin and crisp, had arrived a month ago, smelling faintly of parchment and old paper. A distant great-aunt, a name he barely recognized, had passed, leaving him an inheritance. Not money, not a sensible plot of land, but a cabin. A cabin, the letter specified, deep in the Blackwood Fells. His initial reaction had been a cynical snort. What good was a cabin in the middle of nowhere to a man who lived by his wits among urban ruins? He'd considered selling it sight unseen, but a perverse curiosity, a rare crack in his pragmatic shell, had urged him to at least see it. So he'd packed his sparse belongings into the back of his battered pickup truck, leaving the city's concrete sprawl behind. The journey had been long, the highway gradually narrowing into state routes, then county roads, and finally, little more than gravel tracks winding through an increasingly dense forest. The trees pressed in, ancient and towering, their branches laced together like skeletal fingers against a perpetually gray sky. The air grew colder, thinner, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. An agent service had vanished an hour ago, leaving him with only the drone of his engine and the whisper of the wind through the leaves. A hand-painted sign, barely legible beneath layers of moss and faded paint, marked the turnoff. Blackwood Fells, private property. The track became a barely discernible trail, swallowed by encroaching undergrowth. Cole gripped the steering wheel tighter, a flicker of something he refused to name. Apprehension, stirring in his gut. This was different from the abandoned factories. There, he was the intruder, the scavenger. Here, he felt, observed. He drove for another half-mile, the truck bouncing over roots and rocks, until the trees abruptly thinned, revealing a clearing. And there it was. The cabin wasn't just old, it was ancient, a hunkered silhouette against the backdrop of the dark forest. A guard of rough-hewn logs that had long since weathered to a uniform, somber gray. It seemed less constructed and more grown from the very earth itself. The windows, dark and vacant, were like empty eye sockets staring out from under a heavy, moss-covered roof. A porch, its railings rotted away in places, sagged precariously. No smoke rose from the stone chimney. No lights, no sign of life whatsoever. It looked as though it had been waiting. Cole killed the engine. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the distant murmur of the wind and the rustle of unseen things in the woods. He sat for a moment, absorbing the sight, his initial dismissal giving way to a grudging admission. It was unsettling. Not overtly menacing, but possessed of a stillness that felt unnatural, a quietude that hummed with unspoken things. He pushed open the truck door, the creak echoing loudly in the immense quiet. He walked towards the cabin, his boots crunching on fallen leaves and twigs. The air grew colder the closer he got, carrying a faint, earthy scent, like damp soil mixed with something else, something sharp and metallic. He ran a hand over a rough log wall. The wood felt cold and unyielding, almost alive. A figure at the door, a single rusted horseshoe hung askew, its luck long since run out. The lock on the front door was a heavy, old-fashioned padlock, surprisingly intact. The key, retrieved from an envelope stapled to the will, was cold and intricate. A person a grunt, Cole twisted it. The mechanism groaned, then clicked with a finality that seemed to reverberate through the very foundations of the cabin. He pushed the door open. A wave of cold, stagnant air rushed out, carrying with it the smell of dust, mildew, and something else. Something indefinable, like old, dried blood or forgotten secrets. The interior was swallowed by gloom, the few slivers of light from the windows doing little to penetrate the pervasive darkness. His flashlight beam cut through the murk, revealing a single, large room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. Heavy, dark furniture, shrouded in white sheets, stood like silent, ghostly figures. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he stepped inside, the sound impossibly loud. "Just an old house," he muttered, his voice sounding thin and reedy in the oppressive silence. Dusty, forgotten. Nothing more. He tried to convince himself, to push down the prickle of unease that had begun to creep up his spine. The air was thick, heavy, as if it hadn't been moved in decades. Or as if it were holding its breath. He pulled a sheet off a nearby armchair, sending a cloud of dust into the air. The fabric beneath was faded, but the wood of the frame was dark and heavy. He ran his hand along its arm, feeling the grain. It was just a cabin, an inheritance. A fixer-upper, maybe. Nothing to lose his head over. But then, as his flashlight beam swept across the far wall, it caught on something. A framed photograph, barely visible beneath a film of grime. It was old, sepia-toned, depicting a stern-faced man with eyes that seemed to follow him even from the faded print. And behind the man, barely out of focus, was a stretch of the dark, ancient forest. The same forest that now stood sentinel just beyond the cabin's walls. Cole found himself staring, a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air seeping into his bones. He was alone, deep in the Blackwood Fells, and the cabin felt less like an empty structure and more like a waiting presence. The factory's oppressive gloom was a memory now, a stale film Cole could almost taste on his tongue. He'd left it behind, a monument to a forgotten past, on the winding gravel road that led deeper into the woods, towards his past. The cabin, inherited from a great aunt he barely remembered, stood nestled amongst towering pines, its weathered timber a stark contrast to the vibrant green of the surrounding forest. It was smaller than he'd imagined, a single story with a low-slung roof, but the air here was clean, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, a welcome change from the city's exhaust. He pushed open the heavy front door, the hinges groaning in protest. A colleague Motes, far more ancient than those in the factory, danced in the shafts of weak afternoon light that pierced the grimy windows. The air inside was cold, still, and smelled faintly of wood smoke and something indefinable, something old and patient. This was it then, his new beginning. Cole spent the first few hours in a whirlwind of activity, fueled by a mixture of excitement and a desperate need to dispel the cabin's oppressive stillness. He unpacked boxes, his few belongings seeming paltry in the spacious, empty rooms. He dragged a worn armchair into the living area, swept years of dust from the floorboards, and tried to scrub the grime from the kitchen sink. Each act was an assertion of ownership, a defiant claim against the cabin's quiet resistance. He even managed to get the ancient wood-burning stove roaring, its heat a comforting, crackling presence against the encroaching evening chill. As dusk painted the windows in shades of bruised purple and deep indigo, Cole paused, wiping sweat from his brow. He reached for the sturdy work gloves he'd tossed onto the small, rough-hewn table by the door. His hand met only smooth, cool wood. He frowned. He was sure he'd left them there. He scanned the floor, checked the top of a nearby box, then peered under the table. Nothing. A flicker of annoyance. Then he shrugged it off. He was tired, probably just put them down somewhere else. He found them moments later, tucked neatly inside the top drawer of an old dresser he hadn't even opened yet. Must have put them there without thinking, he mused, a small, unconvincing voice in his head. Later, as he tried to organize the small pantry, a sudden piercing cold swept through the kitchen. It wasn't a draft from an open window. All were tightly latched. It was a pocket of frigid air, sharp and distinct, that seemed to emanate from the corner where the pantry met the outer wall. Cole shivered, pulling his sweater tighter. The cabin was old, he reasoned, full of quirks. Agent houses had cold spots. He'd seal it up in the spring. He settled into the armchair with a book, the only light a single battery-powered lantern casting a warm, flickering glow. The silence of the woods pressed in, a heavy blanket broken only by the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. Then from somewhere deep within the walls came a faint scratching sound. It was subtle, like tiny claws skittering across wood, or perhaps dry leaves rustling against a window pane. He held his breath, listening. It stopped. He waited, his eyes darting toward the darkest corners of the room. Nothing. He exhaled slowly. Mice, probably, or squirrels. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere after all. He tried to focus on his book, but his eyes kept straying, his ears straining for the sound to return. It didn't. A guard bled into a week, and Cole's initial enthusiasm began to fray under the relentless, subtle strangeness. A figure he'd left on the counter would turn up on the mantelpiece. A mug he'd just used would vanish, only to reappear, clean, in the drying rack. The cold spots persisted, migrating from room to room, like an unseen presence moving through the house. The faint sounds grew bolder. A soft creak from the floorboards upstairs, though the cabin was a single story. A whisper of air that felt too much like a sigh. Cole found himself talking to himself more, trying to rationalize each event aloud, as if convincing himself would make it true. One afternoon, while attempting to clear out a narrow, seldom-used closet in the back bedroom, Cole discovered something truly out of place. The closet was crammed with cobwebbed boxes of old canning jars and brittle newspapers. As he reached to pull a particularly heavy box from a high shelf, his fingers brushed against a section of the back wall. It felt different. A person's solid plaster or wood, but hollow. Curious, he pressed harder. A small, almost invisible seam appeared. He pried at it with his fingernails, then with the flat edge of a screwdriver. A narrow wooden panel swung inward with a faint, dry click, revealing a shallow recess in the wall. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded, brittle velvet, lay a small, leather-bound journal. A witness cover was dark, almost black, and felt impossibly old and smooth beneath his fingertips. The leather was cracked in places, the spine bowed with age. No title, no embellishment, just the worn texture of time. He carefully lifted it out, the weight surprisingly substantial. As he turned it over, his thumb brushed against a faded, almost illegible inscription on the back. He squinted in the dim light. The looping script, though faded, was undeniably a variant of his own surname. Cole, an ancestor. The air in the small closet suddenly felt heavier, colder, and the silence of the cabin stretched, expectant. The factory's oppressive gloom was a memory now, a stale film Cole could almost taste on his tongue. He'd left it behind, a monument to a forgotten past, a place he'd sworn he'd never return to. Yet here he was, the iron tang of rust and damp earth filling his nostrils, the very air thick with the weight of generations. The heavy, oak-bound journal, pulled from the hidden recess, felt like a lead weight in his hands, its ancient leather flaking beneath his touch. He had dragged a broken crate to a section of the factory floor where a sliver of weak, gray light pierced a high, grimy window. A colleague motes danced in the anemic beam, oblivious to the disquiet that coiled in Cole's gut. The journal was secured by a tarnished brass clasp, too sturdy to simply pry open. A futile search for a key, Cole's frustration mounted, mirroring the growing anxiety that gnawed at him. He found a discarded wrench, its teeth rusted shut, but its weight was promising. A guard, a grunt, He wedged the flat end of the wrench into the clasp's seam, applying pressure. The metal groaned, protesting. Then with a sharp crack, it gave way. The journal fell open with a sigh of brittle paper. The pages were yellowed, some corners crumbling. The ink faded to a sepia whisper. The first page was not text, but a drawing. Crude, yet undeniably unsettling. It depicted a figure, elongated and gaunt, with an almost featureless face, standing before a towering structure that vaguely resembled the factory's central chimney. The figure, swirling lines seemed to emanate, like tendrils of smoke or some ethereal energy. At its feet, smaller, stooped figures appeared to offer something, their faces obscured by shadow. Cole's breath hitched. This wasn't some abstract doodle. This felt deliberate. He turned the page, the dry paper rasping. The script was an archaic, spidery hand, difficult to decipher. He squinted, tracing the words with a hesitant finger. It spoke of the person below and offerings to the witness watcher. His ancestors, it seemed, weren't just industrialists. They were something else. Officer entries detailed strange rituals performed in the factory's deepest levels, particularly during the new moon. There were mentions of sustaining the hum and the necessity of the veil. Cryptic, disturbing phrases intertwined with what looked like records of production and profit, a bizarre juxtaposition of the mundane and the deeply arcane. One page bore a recurring symbol, a jagged, broken circle with 3 radiating lines, etched repeatedly, almost compulsively. It was a symbol he'd seen before, though he couldn't immediately place where. A shiver traced its way down his spine. As he delved deeper, the factory around him began to stir. What had been easily dismissed as the wind or the groan of old metal now became distinct. A rhythmic, soft thump-thump echoed from the floor above, slow and deliberate, like something heavy being dragged. Cole froze, journal suspended, his ears straining. The sound continued, moving, coming closer to the stairwell that led to the upper levels. He tried to rationalize it. A rat, a loose pipe, the building settling. But the sound had a purpose, a weight to it that felt too substantial for natural causes. He flipped to a page describing the stirring, a period of heightened activity before the great below demanded its due. His eyes darted to the drawing of the gaunt figure. The lines swirling around it suddenly seemed less like smoke and more like a presence. A cold draft snaked around his ankles, impossibly cold for the stagnant air. He pulled his jacket tighter, his gaze sweeping the vast, empty space. He was alone, yet the silence felt crowded. The thump-thump stopped abruptly, replaced by a faint, almost imperceptible scrape directly above him. It sounded like something dragging itself across the concrete. Cole squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, trying to force the unsettling images from his mind, trying to ground himself in logic. But the journal in his hands, the disturbing symbols, the chilling descriptions of his family's dark legacy, they were too real, too tangible. When he opened his eyes, he saw it, or thought he did. At the very edge of his peripheral vision, near a stack of collapsed crates, a shadow seemed to deepen, to coalesce into something denser than mere absence of light. It was gone before he could fully turn his head, dissolving back into the factory's natural gloom. His heart hammered against his ribs. He was being watched. The thought wasn't a question, but a cold, undeniable certainty. The air grew heavy, pressing in on him. The factory, once just a decaying building, now felt like a living entity, its vast spaces holding secrets that were now irrevocably becoming his own. He clutched the journal, its brittle pages a testament to a truth he wasn't ready to accept. A truth that was now reaching out, demanding his attention. The thump-thump started again, this time from the ground floor further away, but unmistakably moving towards him. He was no longer just an observer. He was part of whatever dark legacy his ancestors had unearthed, and something in the factory was very much aware of his presence. The factory's oppressive gloom was a memory now, a stale film Cole could almost taste on his tongue. He'd left it behind, a monument to a forgotten past, and driven the winding, unpaved road deeper into the wilderness. The sun, a pale, anemic disk in the sky, seemed to have given up trying to penetrate the oppressive canopy of ancient trees that lined the route. He was heading for Havenwood, the nearest settlement, a dot on the map rumored to house the few descendants of those who once worked the now-defunct mills and mines. A colleague was less a town and more a collection of weathered shacks and stoic two-story houses huddled together against the encroaching forest. An agent peeled from every surface, and sagging porches seemed to sigh under the weight of decades. No children played in the dusty street. No music drifted from open windows. A single, flickering neon sign promised grub groceries above what appeared to be the only functioning establishment. Cole parked his car, its engine ticking quietly in the sudden silence, and stepped out. The air here was different, heavier, smelling of damp earth and something indefinable. Old wood, stagnant water, and a faint metallic tang. He pushed open the creaking door of the general store. A bell above his head jingled, its sound startlingly loud in the quiet. Inside, the light was dim, filtered through grimy windows. A guard lined with dusty, generic goods stood like silent sentinels. A figure, a scarred wooden counter. A woman with a face like worn leather and eyes that seemed to have seen too much regarded him with an unsettling lack of surprise. She was polishing a glass, her movements slow and deliberate. "Can Cole help you, stranger?" Her voice was raspy, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Cole hopes so," Cole replied, trying for a friendly tone. "His name's Cole. Colum looking into his family's history. His grandfather, Silas Thorne, he was from around here. A person at the old mill." The woman stopped polishing. Her gaze sharpened, losing its detached quality. A flicker of something, recognition, suspicion, or perhaps fear, crossed her features before settling back into a mask of weary indifference. "Thorne, you say? Haven't heard that name in a long time." They mostly moved on, or stayed put in the ground. "Cole, no," Cole said, feeling a prickle of unease. But Colum trying to understand why they left, what happened here, the factory. It felt like something was wrong. She snorted, a dry, humorless sound. "Wrong? Son, everything's been wrong here for longer than you've been alive. This land, it's old, and it remembers." She resumed polishing, her eyes fixed on the glass, not him. Cole pressed on. Remembers what? His grandfather. He never spoke much about this place, but there was always an undercurrent of something. Fear, maybe. The witness voice, deeper and gravelly, cut in from the shadowy corner of the store. An old man, almost swallowed by a high-backed armchair, slowly lowered a newspaper. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, and his eyes, though clouded with age, held a surprising intensity. "Silas Thorne, you say? A good man, an officer to fight it like the others." Cole turned to the old man. "Fight what?" The old man's gaze drifted towards the window where the dark line of the forest began almost immediately beyond the last houses. "The woods, boy. They ain't just trees. A detective around here. They call them the Whispering Woods, but it ain't the wind you hear, not always. It's talking, calling." The woman behind the counter cleared her throat, a sharp, warning sound. The old man ignored her, his eyes still fixed on the forest. "Your kin? They built that factory to keep it at bay, you know, or to feed it. A specialist on who you ask." Cole's heart gave a cold lurch. "Feed what? What is it?" The old man finally looked at Cole, his ancient eyes locking onto his. "It's the land, boy, or what grew from it. A technician old, something hungry. It lies dormant for a time, Then it stirs. And when it stirs, it wants. It always wants. Your grandfather, he left because he knew. He saw it claim too many. Claim them how? Cole's voice was barely a whisper. The vague unease he'd felt since arriving had solidified into a chilling dread. The woods take them. Or they just change, go mad. The lucky ones disappear entirely. The others, they stay, but they ain't themselves anymore. A colleague's shells hollowed out, their eyes reflecting something else entirely. The old man shuddered, a tremor running through his frail frame. It started with the whispers, always the whispers. A agent the dreams. And then, it comes for you. The woman slammed the polished glass onto the counter, a sharp crack that broke the spell. Enough, Silas, you'll scare the boy off. A guard things are best left buried. Some things can't be buried, Martha, Silas retorted, his voice gaining a surprising strength. Not when they're rooted as deep as this. It's coming again, Cole feel it. Always does after a long silence. And you, young Thorne, you stirring up the dust. You might just be ringing the dinner bell. Cole felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. The cryptic warnings, the fear in their eyes, the heavy atmosphere of the town. It all coalesced into a terrifying confirmation of his deepest fears. The factory wasn't just a place of industry. It was a monument to a desperate, perhaps futile struggle. And the Whispering Woods. They weren't just woods. They were the source of an ancient, malevolent presence, a hunger that had lain dormant, and now, perhaps, was beginning to stir again, drawn by his very presence. He had come seeking answers, and he had found them, chilling and undeniable. He was not just tracing his family's past. He was walking into a trap set long ago, a legacy of dread he was now forced to confront. The factory's oppressive gloom was a memory now. A stale film Cole could almost taste on his tongue. A bitter aftertaste he'd hoped to scrub clean with the crisp, clean air of the woods. He'd left it behind, a monument to a forgotten past, a place that had seemed to hold its breath around him. The cabin, a rough-hewn box of timber and shadow, was meant to be an antidote, a sanctuary from the creeping unease that had shadowed his every step. Yet, as the sun dipped below the tree line, painting the small, grimy windows with fleeting strokes of orange and purple, the sense of dread only deepened, shifting its form from the industrial chill to something far more intimate and insidious. The cabin air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp wood and forgotten dust. Cole paced the small living space, his boots thudding softly on the warped floorboards. Each creak, each groan of the settling structure seemed amplified, taking on a sinister quality in the encroaching darkness. He'd tried to light the old oil lamp, but the wick had been stubborn, spitting and sputtering, casting erratic dancing shadows that stretched and shrank like grotesque marionettes on the walls. He found himself flinching at their movements, his gaze darting to the corners, convinced he saw something shift just beyond the periphery of his vision. He sank onto the threadbare couch, its springs groaning in protest, and tried to focus on the distant chirping of crickets, anything to drown out the frantic rhythm of his own heart. But the silence inside the cabin was too profound, too absolute. It pressed in on him, a physical weight that made his breath catch in his throat. He felt watched, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, as if an unseen gaze was burning into him from the shadows that clung to the ceiling beams. A colleague had started. It began subtly, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper that seemed to ride the currents of the still air. It was too indistinct to make out words, just a breathy rustle, like dry leaves skittering across a forgotten floor. Cole froze, his head cocked, listening. The sound vanished, leaving behind an even more profound silence. He shook his head, blaming it on the wind, on his frayed nerves. He stood up, intending to fetch another match for the lamp, when a cold spot bloomed on his arm, a sudden icy touch that made him gasp. He jerked away, his eyes wide, scanning the empty space beside him. Nothing. No open window, no draft. A agent the stale, oppressive air. Then, the shadows in the far corner of the room began to coalesce. It wasn't a trick of the light, not this time. The darkness deepened, swirling inwards like ink dropped into water, forming a vaguely humanoid shape. It was indistinct, lacking features yet undeniably present, a void within the gloom. Cole's breath hitched. He couldn't move. His muscles locked, his blood turning to ice in his veins. The shape elongated, reaching, stretching towards him like a hand fashioned from pure night. And then, a voice. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was dry, ancient, a sound like gravel grinding together, yet clear as a bell, cutting through the suffocating silence. It came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating within the very timbers of the cabin, within Cole's own skull. Cole. His name. A guard with a chilling finality that left no room for doubt. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't his imagination. This was real. The shadowy form pulsed, a silent, malevolent beat in the corner, holding his gaze in a grip of pure, unadulterated terror. He stumbled backwards, tripping over the worn rug, landing hard on the floorboards. The impact jarred him, but the fear was a far more potent shock. His mind reeled, grasping for a rational explanation, anything to dispel the impossible vision, the impossible sound. He was tired, stressed, he told himself. The factory had gotten to him. He was losing his mind. But even as the thoughts formed, they felt hollow, flimsy. The presence in the room was too potent, too absolute. The walls of the cabin, once a comforting barrier against the wilderness, now felt like they were closing in. The low ceiling pressed down. The timber beams seemed to lean inwards, ready to crush him. The windows, dark mirrors reflecting his own horrified face, offered no escape, only the impenetrable blackness of the woods outside. He was trapped. A figure with it. A primal scream clawed at his throat, but only a choked gasp escaped. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the impending darkness. The air grew colder, heavy with an unseen weight, and Cole pressed himself further against the floor, his eyes fixed on the corner where the shadow still writhed. He was no longer just afraid. He was drowning in an ocean of pure, unreasoning terror. The cabin, his supposed refuge, had become a tomb. The factory's oppressive gloom was a memory now, a stale film Cole could almost taste on his tongue, a bitter aftertaste he'd hoped to scrub clean with frantic searching. He'd spent days, perhaps weeks, since his last harrowing encounter, combing through the rusted husks and decaying offices of the derelict plant. He was no longer looking for answers about his family's business, but for any answer, any thread that might explain the gnawing terror that had taken root in his soul. The journal he'd found in the cabin, its cryptic entries now etched into his memory, had hinted at a darkness far older than the factory's industrial demise. He'd been drawn back here, an inexplicable pull, as if the factory itself was a part of the greater puzzle, a piece of the same cursed legacy. The air was thick with the scent of damp metal and decay, a constant reminder of things left to rot. One afternoon, while prying open a particularly stubborn, waterlogged filing cabinet in a forgotten administrative wing, his fingers brushed against something solid and out of place. A colleague a false back, concealed by decades of grime and rust, was a small, lead-lined box. It felt unnervingly heavy, the weight of it pressing down on his already frayed nerves. His heart hammered, a frantic drum against his ribs. He carried the box to a patch of weak sunlight filtering through a grimy window, the only source of light strong enough to truly see by. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried, brittle herbs that crumbled to dust at the slightest touch, lay not another journal, but a collection of brittle parchment scrolls, bound with dried sinew and a single obsidian shard, sharp as a razor, cool to the touch. The scrolls were written in a sprawling, archaic hand, similar to the journal he already possessed, yet more detailed, more precise in their horrific intent. Cole's hands trembled as he unrolled the first scroll. The language was denser, more esoteric, filled with symbols and diagrams that made his stomach clench. But certain words, phrases, even entire paragraphs, began to resonate with the fragments he'd already pieced together from the cabin journal. He recognized names, his own family name, recurring with a sickening frequency. The Thorn lineage. The scrolls spoke of an ancestor, the Agent Thorn, a man driven by desperation and a thirst for power, who had sought to tame the untamable. They detailed a ritual, performed not in the cabin itself, but on the very land the cabin now stood upon. Land that encompassed the factory, the surrounding woods, a forgotten, cursed acreage. It was a ritual of binding, a pact made with something ancient, something that predated human memory, a force of raw, untamed, primal fear. The descriptions were chillingly vague, yet terrifyingly specific. It was not a spirit, nor a demon in the conventional sense, but an echo of primordial chaos, a hunger given form by the ritual, tethered to the earth by blood and promise. Elias, the scrolls explained, had sought its power to ensure his family's prosperity, to ward off ruin, to gain influence beyond mortal means. He had offered it a conduit, a vessel, a permanent tether to the mortal coil. Cole read on, his breath catching in his throat, the factory's ambient groans and creaks suddenly sounding like the strained breaths of something vast and suffering. The pact wasn't a one-time deal. It was a generational burden. The Thorn family, through their lineage, were not just beneficiaries but caretakers, guardians of the binding. And now, Cole was the last in line. A cold dread seeped into his bones, colder than the factory air. He was not just living in his ancestors' shadow. He was inextricably woven into their dark tapestry. The land, the cabin, this very factory, they were all part of the same monstrous contract. And the entity, the ancient hunger, was stirring. The final scroll, its edges singed as if by fire, detailed the entity's needs. It wasn't simple sustenance or freedom. It craved attention, acknowledgement, and a specific kind of renewal. The text was fragmented here, almost deliberately obscured, but the message, despite the archaic phrasing, was clear. The binding was weakening. The entity required a new anchor, a new vessel to reaffirm the pact, to strengthen its hold, to ensure its continued presence. Cole stared at the obsidian shard, then back at the scorched parchment. The new anchor, the new vessel. A horrifying realization dawned on him, chilling him to his core. The entity wasn't just bound to the land, it was bound to the bloodline. And it wanted him. A guard just his life, but his essence, his very being, to become the new conduit, the next link in a chain of unending dread. The factory groaned again, a long, drawn-out sigh, as if the very structure was confirming his worst fears. The bitter taste in his mouth intensified, no longer just the factory's decay, but the metallic tang of his own terror. He was trapped, a pawn in a game generations old, and the rules of engagement were written in blood. The entity was awake, and it was calling for him. Cole's mind was a tangled knot of dread. The factory's oppressive gloom was a memory now, a stale film Cole could almost taste on his tongue, a bitter aftertaste he'd hoped to scrub clean with the quiet solitude of this cabin. But the solitude had curdled, turning into a suffocating presence, a silent watcher that had sunk its roots deep into the very beams of the structure, into the soil outside. Every creak of the floorboards was a whisper, every shadow a shifting form. He couldn't stay. Not another minute. He stumbled to his feet, a desperate urgency propelling him towards the door. The air in the cabin felt thick, heavy, pressing down on him. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the impending doom he felt closing in. He reached for the cold iron handle, his fingers fumbling. It turned with a groan that seemed to echo through the silence, and he yanked it open, gulping in a ragged breath of the night air. The darkness outside was absolute, a wall of black velvet that swallowed the weak glow from the cabin's windows. The woods, usually a comforting embrace, now felt like a predatory maw. Still, anything was better than here. He stepped out, not bothering to close the door behind him, his boots crunching on the dry leaves of the porch. The cold bite of the wind was a welcome slap, a small anchor to reality. He plunged into the trees, the path he'd taken earlier in the day now swallowed by the oppressive gloom. He had no flashlight, no real plan, just the desperate need to put distance between himself and that cabin. He ran, pushing through low-hanging branches that snagged at his clothes, his face. The sounds of the night, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of unseen creatures, were amplified, each one a potential threat. He imagined eyes watching him from the deep shadows, following his erratic progress. He ran until his lungs burned, a sharp, searing pain in his chest. He tripped over a root, sprawling heavily onto the leaf-strewn ground, the impact jarring his teeth. He lay there for a moment, gasping, the cold earth seeping through his clothes. He pushed himself up, disoriented, unsure of which way he'd come, or which way led to the distant, imagined safety of the main road. He started walking again, faster now, a frantic energy possessing him. He pushed through a thicket of thorny bushes, ignoring the scratches that tore at his skin. He felt a strange pull, a subtle shift in the air, as if the very direction he was heading was being gently, inexorably altered. He kept walking, convinced he was moving deeper into the woods, away from the cabin. Then a familiar sight. A gnarled oak, its branches like skeletal fingers against the inky sky. He'd passed that tree before, earlier in his escape. A shiver of dread traced its way down his spine. He was circling. He must be. No, he told himself. It was just the darkness playing tricks. He veered sharply, determined to break the invisible loop. He walked for what felt like hours, his legs aching, his mind a jumble of fear and exhaustion. The woods seemed to close in, the trees growing denser, their branches weaving together overhead to form an impenetrable canopy. He couldn't see the stars, couldn't tell direction. Every path he took seemed to lead him back to the same cluster of ancient twisted pines. Suddenly, a barrier. Not a physical wall, but an invisible force that pushed against him, firm and unyielding. He stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. He tried again, pushing forward, but it was like running into solid rock. He felt a pressure against his chest, a cold, unseen hand pushing him away. He cried out, a raw, desperate sound that was swallowed by the silent woods. A whisper slithered into his mind, not a sound in the air, but a thought planted directly in his skull. There is no escape. It was his own voice, yet laced with a chilling alien quality. He shook his head violently, trying to dislodge it. He was losing his mind. He had to be. He turned, desperate, and saw a flicker of light through the trees. The cabin. No, it couldn't be. He had walked for miles. He had been pushed back. He fought against the invisible current, but it was like trying to swim against a raging river. The light grew brighter, the shape of the cabin clearer. He was being drawn back, pulled by an unseen tether. He stumbled onto the porch, his legs heavy, his mind screaming in protest. The door he'd left open was now shut, a solid, unforgiving slab of wood. He reached for the handle, his hand trembling. It was cold, colder than it should be. He pushed the door open, the same groan echoing as before. The cabin air, once thick, now felt suffocating. The shadows seemed deeper, more alive. The silence was not empty, but filled with a watchful presence that hummed just beneath the threshold of his hearing. He was back, trapped. The entity had merely allowed him to exhaust himself, to experience the futility of his efforts, before reeling him back in. The four walls of the cabin felt less like shelter and more like the confines of a cage. The trap had sprung, and Cole was firmly caught. His heart sank, a leaden weight in his chest. A colleague wasn't impossible. It was a cruel illusion. Cole's mind was a tangled knot of dread. The factory's oppressive gloom was a memory now. A stale film Cole could almost taste on his tongue, a bitter residue of its decay clinging to his senses. He was no longer just in the factory. He was part of it, woven into its decaying fabric by unseen, malevolent threads. The air, thick with the scent of rust and damp earth, seemed to press in on him, a physical weight on his chest. Every shadow held a deeper, more profound darkness, and the silence was no longer empty but filled with a resonant hum that vibrated in his teeth. He had tried to escape. He had tried to run, to find a door, a window, any crack in the factory's ancient shell. But every path led him back, every perceived exit dissolving into another stretch of derelict machinery, another crumbling wall, another dead end. It was a labyrinth designed not to confuse, but to contain. The entity wasn't chasing him anymore. It was simply waiting. It had him. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, knocking the wind from his lungs. He wasn't going to escape. He was trapped. A cold, hard resolve began to crystallize in the swirling chaos of his fear. If he couldn't run, he had to fight. He had to confront this thing, this ancient, malevolent presence that had claimed his world. But how did one fight an entity that existed in the shadows between thoughts, that fed on despair, that warped reality with a mere whisper? He needed a weapon, not of steel, but of knowledge. He needed to find its weakness, to uncover the forgotten ritual that could break its hold, or banish it back to whatever hellish void it had crawled from. His gaze swept across the factory floor, no longer seeking an exit, but a clue. The colossal machines, hulking and skeletal, seemed to watch him, their rusted gears like silent, accusing eyes. He moved with a new purpose, his desperation fueling a frantic energy. He began to search, his hands brushing against cold, greasy metal, pushing aside splintered crates, kicking through piles of rotting refuse. He started in the grimy, abandoned administrative offices, hoping for old ledgers, a forgotten journal, anything that might hint at the factory's dark history. A colleague lay overturned, papers scattered and yellowed, their ink faded into illegibility. He found nothing but dust and the ghosts of forgotten labor. The hum in the air intensified, a low thrum that seemed to vibrate from the very foundations of the building, a mocking counterpoint to his frantic search. An agent by a desperate hunch, Cole descended into the factory's deepest levels, a network of damp, claustrophobic tunnels beneath the main floor. The air grew heavier, colder, carrying the unmistakable scent of something ancient and putrid. Here, the machinery was even older, more archaic, some of it half submerged in stagnant water. He navigated by the dim beam of his phone, its light struggling against the oppressive gloom. He felt a distinct shift in the entity's presence. It was no longer just a hum, but a subtle pressure against his skin, a whisper that seemed to caress the edges of his sanity, suggesting thoughts of despair, of futility. He stumbled into a small, forgotten chamber, not much larger than a closet, tucked away behind a rusted boiler. The air here was thick with a cloying sweetness, like decaying flowers. In the center, almost obscured by a cascade of crumbling brick dust, stood a small, crude pedestal. On it, nestled amongst petrified wood chips and dried, unidentifiable leaves, lay a single leather-bound book. Its cover was unadorned, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. Cole's fingers trembled as he picked it up. The leather was surprisingly supple, almost warm. He opened it carefully, the ancient binding groaning in protest. The script inside was a flowing, almost elegant hand, But the language was archaic, filled with symbols he didn't recognize. He scanned the pages, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. It wasn't a standard logbook. It was a journal, its entries dating back to the factory's very inception. The original owner, perhaps? He flipped through, desperate for a sign, a keyword. Then a page caught his eye, filled with a frantic scrawl, starkly different from the earlier measured hand. It detailed a series of unfortunate occurrences, the shadow that grew with the factory's hunger. And then, a passage that made his blood run cold. It feeds on the industry's sorrow, the crushing of the spirit, the grind of the ceaseless work. Its strength is in the despair it cultivates. But it is bound to the material, to the earth from which the factory rose. The iron, the coal, the very dust of its making. To break its hold, one must turn the material against it. The ringing of the iron bell, the pure sound of defiance, mixed with the earth's true lament. A counter-vibration. It weakens its hold on the soul. It does not banish, but it breaks the pact. Cole reread the words, his mind racing. The ringing of the iron bell. He thought of the old foundry bell, a colossal, tarnished thing he'd seen hanging near the main entrance, long since silent. Mixed with the earth's true lament. What did that mean? The journal offered no further explanation, the following pages torn out or lost to time. A cold, spectral breath ghosted across his neck. The hum in the air sharpened, growing into a dissonant chord that threatened to shatter his eardrums. The shadows in the chamber seemed to deepen, coalescing into indistinct shapes at the periphery of his vision. The entity was aware. It knew he had found something. Cole clutched the journal, his knuckles white. The information was fragmented, maddeningly vague, but it was a path. A desperate, dangerous path. He wouldn't banish it, not entirely, but he could break its hold, sever its connection to him, to this place. It was a risk, a final, desperate stand against an ancient evil. He looked up, his gaze piercing the oppressive gloom. He knew what he had to do. He had to find the bell, and he had to make it ring. The factory's gates, a maw of rusted iron, seemed to groan a welcome as Cole pushed them open. The oppressive gloom he remembered was no longer a film. It was a physical weight, pressing down on him, stealing the air from his lungs. The air inside hummed with a low, almost subsonic thrum, a sound that vibrated in his teeth and rattled his bones. His mind, once a tangled knot of dread, was now a single taut wire of resolve. There was no going back. He moved through the skeletal remains of production lines, the silence broken only by the drip of unseen water and the scuttling of unseen things. Each step echoed too loudly, swallowed by the vast cavernous space. The cold was a living thing, seeping into his marrow, but Cole barely registered it. His focus was on the chamber, the heart of the blight, where he knew the true horror resided. When he reached it, the air thickened, growing heavy with the metallic tang of old blood and the cloying sweetness of decay. The central chamber, once a place of industry, was now an altar to something ancient and malevolent. Akali girders formed a grotesque canopy overhead, and the floor was slick with a dark, viscous residue that shimmered faintly in the dim light filtering through grimy windows. Cole knelt, his breath catching in his throat. He pulled out the few items he had painstakingly gathered. A small, tarnished silver locket, a handful of dried, brittle herbs, and a shard of obsidian he'd found by chance, its edge razor-sharp. An agent were his tools, his desperate hope against a force that defied understanding. He arranged them in a crude circle on the grimy floor, his hands trembling not from fear, but from the immense pressure of the moment. As he began to chant, the words ancient and guttural, the factory awoke. The low thrum intensified, becoming a furious grind. A guard detached themselves from the walls, coalescing, stretching, twisting into grotesque parodies of human forms. They writhed around him, their silent screams palpable, a chorus of despair. The air grew impossibly cold, then searing hot, as if the very atmosphere was tearing itself apart. Then the entity manifested. It wasn't a single shape, but a horrifying amalgamation of the factory itself. A figure metal shrieked and bent, forming skeletal limbs that scraped against the concrete. Gears, long seized, began to grind with agonizing slowness, their teeth like gnashing jaws. A person ruptured, spewing not water, but a thick, black ichor that pulsed with an unholy light. A witness head was a gaping maw of shattered machinery, a vortex of broken parts, and its eyes were the last dying embers of a forgotten furnace, glowing with malevolent intelligence. It was the factory's decay, its suffering, its forgotten souls given monstrous parasitic form. It reared up, a colossal industrial nightmare, filling the chamber with its horrific presence. The air vibrated with the sound of 1,000 tortured voices, all speaking in a language of agony and despair, burrowing into Cole's mind. He clutched the obsidian shard, the locket digging into his palm. The entity lunged, not with physical force, but with tendrils of pure psychic dread, attempting to shatter his will, to absorb him into its decaying maw. An officer flashed before his eyes. His father's face, a childhood laugh, moments of peace. All twisted, corrupted, offered as bait to break him. He pushed back, his chant growing louder, a desperate defiance against the overwhelming horror. But the entity's grip tightened. He felt its tendrils inside him, not just in his mind, but in his very blood. A cold, invasive presence that had been feeding on his resolve, his life force, since he first stepped foot in this place. The counter-ritual was failing. It demanded more. A terrible, undeniable truth slammed into him. To sever the ties, he had to cut a piece of himself, a physical anchor that the entity had latched onto. The left hand, the one that had first reached for the corrupted object, the one that had been drawn back to this place again and again. It was the conduit, the bridge. With a guttural cry, Cole raised the obsidian shard. The entity shrieked, a cacophony of grinding metal and tortured souls, sensing his intent. It thrashed, its mechanical limbs reaching, trying to stop him, to consume him before he could complete the ultimate severance. He didn't hesitate. A detective his teeth, he brought the shard down, its razor edge biting deep into the flesh of his left wrist. A specialist grated, muscle tore. A searing pain, unlike anything he had ever known, exploded through him, momentarily eclipsing the entity's psychic assault. Hot, arterial blood gushed, pooling on the grimy floor, mixing with the dark ichor. With a final, desperate heave, he twisted, severing the last sinews, the last connection. His left hand, still clutching the locket, fell to the floor with a wet thud. As his hand hit the ground, a shockwave of pure energy erupted from Cole. The entity recoiled, its form destabilizing, screaming a sound that was less a shriek and more a tearing of reality itself. The furnace eyes flickered, dimmed, and then died. The grinding gears seized, the metal limbs collapsed into heaps of rusted scrap. The black ichor evaporated, leaving only a foul, lingering stench. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, replaced by a sudden, terrifying silence. Cole gasped, clutching his stump, his vision blurring. The ritual was complete. The ties were severed. The entity was gone, banished, or perhaps merely quiescent, its malevolent essence scattered. He was alive. But the cost. The cost was etched into his very being, a phantom limb that would ache with the memory of the factory's horror forever. The silence of the factory was no longer a promise of peace, but a chilling testament to the sacrifice he had made. The last guttural shriek had been sucked into the factory's cavernous throat, leaving behind a silence so profound it vibrated in Cole's bones. He slumped against the cold, grimy wall, his body a trembling wreck, every muscle screaming in protest. The air, thick moments ago with the stench of ozone and decay, now tasted merely of dust and rust. He had done it. He had banished it. The thought was a fragile, shimmering thing, barely able to stand against the sheer, crushing exhaustion that threatened to pull him into unconsciousness. His breath hitched, a ragged, wet sound in the sudden quiet. He pushed himself upright, his vision blurring. The vast, empty space before him, where the entity had manifested in its most terrible form, now seemed clean. The oppressive gloom that had clung to every beam and gear was gone, replaced by the weak gray light filtering through the grimy windows. The shadows, once predatory and alive, were just shadows. The victory felt hollow, a heavy stone in his gut. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the grit and sweat, the dried tears he hadn't even registered. His clothes were torn, his skin scraped, but the deeper wounds were not physical. The past hours, days, weeks even, had etched themselves into his very core. He had faced the thing, stared into its abyss, and somehow, impossibly, survived. He had driven it back, forced it from this place. But as he took a tentative step, a strange sensation prickled at the base of his spine. It wasn't the old dread, the visceral terror that had been his constant companion. This was something new, colder, subtler. The factory wasn't just quiet. It was too quiet. The silence wasn't empty. It was pregnant, watchful. Every sound Cole made, the scuff of his boot, the rasp of his breath, felt amplified, an intrusion in a space that had suddenly become sacredly still. He walked through the main assembly floor, past the skeletal remains of machinery, the vast, silent presses that looked like sleeping metal giants. He expected to feel a lightness, a sense of release. Instead, a profound emptiness settled over him, heavier than any fear. He was free, yes, but what had he lost in the process? He stopped by a pool of stagnant water, reflecting the broken ceiling. He stared at his own reflection, a gaunt, hollow-eyed stranger. But it wasn't just the exhaustion that startled him. There was a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer in his eyes, a glint that hadn't been there before, like a tiny shard of obsidian embedded deep within. A coldness, too, not just on his skin, but within him. A deep, pervasive chill that seemed to emanate from his very bones. It wasn't unpleasant, not exactly, but it was profoundly unsettling. It felt like a resonance, a lingering echo of the power he had confronted, a fragment of its essence that had somehow fused with his own. He reached out, his fingers brushing the surface of the water. The ripples spread, distorting his reflection, and for a fleeting instant, he thought he saw something else in the depths, a flicker of something ancient and hungry, before it vanished. His gaze drifted to the floor, to the very ground beneath his feet. The concrete, usually so unyielding, felt different now. He could almost imagine a faint rhythmic pulse beneath the grime, a slow, deep thrumming that was just beyond the edge of hearing. The land itself. The entity had been tied to this place, to the very earth. He had banished it, yes, but had he truly severed its connection, or merely forced it into a deeper slumber? A colleague, the factory merely dormant, holding its breath, waiting for the precise moment to stir again? He moved towards the main gates, the rusted iron maw that had seemed to welcome him into the darkness. As he pushed one open, the groan of metal was surprisingly muted, lacking the malevolent resonance it once held. The outside world, a blur of gray sky and distant city hum, seemed distant, unreal. He stepped out, turning back to face the factory. It stood there, silent and imposing, no longer radiating overt menace. But the coldness in his chest intensified, and the subtle shimmer in his eyes seemed to deepen. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he hadn't truly won. He had merely changed the game. The entity was not gone. It was simply elsewhere. Or perhaps it had found a new vessel, a new anchor, a new place to reside. A faint, almost imperceptible breeze whispered through the open gates, carrying with it a scent that was not rust, not dust, but something else entirely. A faint metallic tang, like old blood, and something else, something primal and cold. It was the scent of the entity, a ghost of its presence, and Cole realized, with a sickening lurch of his stomach, that he could now perceive it, subtly, constantly. He carried it with him. He had banished the entity from the factory, but a piece of it, a sliver of its terrible awareness, had grafted itself onto him, a parasitic twin in his own soul. He was changed, irrevocably. The world was no longer just the world. It was a thin veil over something vast and hungry. He had seen beyond the curtain, and a piece of that darkness had followed him back. He was free, yes, but he was also marked. The dread was no longer an external threat. It was a quiet, constant companion, a chill that would never truly leave him. The factory was silent, but Cole knew with a